Welcome back, everybody, to the NCAA Next Up Dynasty here on NCAA Football 14 as we watch the stars of tomorrow competing in the 2023 college football season. The regular season and conference championships are now over. We have made it to the postseason, and we need to decide who gets into the college football playoff. How are we going to do that? You at home will decide. So there is a Google form. The link is in the description, and you'll be able to vote for not just the teams who get into the first ever 12-team college football playoff, but we're also going to have voting for the Heisman Trophy, along with all the other major awards. Also in the description, you'll find a spreadsheet with every team in the top 25 with their opponent's record, point differential, strength of schedule, top 25 wins, all that stuff. I got to give a quick shout out to my good friend Garrett. He put all of this together in the spreadsheet, so major shout out to him. So what today's video is for is I'm going to go over everybody's resume, why they are in consideration for the college football playoff or the Heisman Trophy, and then from there, you guys will be able to make a formulated decision. I don't think formulated is a word, but a good decision on who you think belongs in the college football playoff. In the last episode, we watched every conference championship game. The 5 Power 5 champions have automatic bids into the college football playoff, and you guys will be voting for their seeding, along with the highest-ranked Group 5 conference champions. So there are 6 teams already in the playoffs. We just got to decide the seeding. And then there are 6 at-large bids for the non-conference championship teams, how they will end up getting in. And then, of course, the Heisman Trophy as well. I'm pretty sure we have 7 or 8 guys in consideration for the award, in which you guys will be able to figure out who deserves to win that, along with all of the awards. So let's start with the 6 main conference champions. They will be the top 6 seeds in some order, and you guys have to decide the order. We'll start with the number 1 ranked Clemson Tigers of the ACC. They are the only team in college football to go undefeated through the regular season and then demolishing Duke in the conference championship. I mean, these guys really do have the resume. Only 2 one-score wins. They blew out Florida State. They blew out Syracuse. They blew out Duke in the conference championship. Of course, led by senior quarterback Kate Hutchinson, who's in consideration for the Heisman Trophy and will likely be the number 1 pick in the draft. They've got plenty of playmakers on offense, including Kobe Henderson, Latrell McAllister, Xavier Mayo, Jordan Jones, Kion Cordell, amongst others. They've got a great offensive line, and their defense is really, really solid as well, particularly in the back end. They've got some good young linebackers with Chernov and Dayton Quinn. They've got some good young pass rushers, including Gaston Miller Jr. And then looking at the secondary, guys like Markeith Brown, Alec Badfield, Darian French, and Zaire Joolham. The next team we'll go through is the Big Ten champion Ohio State Buckeyes, who went 12-1 this year, with their only loss being a hiccup back in Week 6 to Wisconsin. But if you look at these scores and this resume, it is really impressive. They've played against some really good teams, and they've mopped the floor. They blew out Notre Dame. They blew out Michigan at the Big House. They blew out Penn State. They blew out Indiana, and then they were able to beat a really good Oregon team in the conference championship. And I think their resume really stacks up with number 1 Clemson. Marco Burnley has had an up-and-down season at quarterback, but he's a really, really good player. Mookie Davis out of the backfield is a star. And then if you look at their weapons, they've got some ballers. Auden Green, Jazz Suggs, who played really well in the conference championship. Trey Miller, amongst others. But this team is really led by their defense. Probably the most talented defense in the country. They've got really good players up front with Elliott Holy, Torian Mason, Hercules Oceanus, Napoleon Christian, amongst others. But the secondary is really what's impressive. Jameer Jefferson Jr., in my opinion, is the most talented defensive player in the country. And then don't forget about Steve Stifler, who we saw dominate in the Big Ten championship with 3 TFLs, 2 sacks, 2 interceptions, and a fumble force. The next team we'll go through is the Middle Tennessee State Blue Raiders, who won the American Athletic Conference. This is not a Power 5 conference, but they're the highest-ranked Group 5 team, and thus they'll get an automatic bid. So Middle Tennessee State made the college football playoff last year. They lost in the semifinal to Georgia, and they have unfinished business, clearly. They did lose a game this year to a really solid Navy team, but other than that, it's been a rock-solid season. They have a ranked win over Central Michigan, and then they handled SMU pretty easily in the conference championship. There are some different faces compared to last year's team, specifically at quarterback with junior Drain Ignatius, who really improved throughout the season. He's got plenty of playmakers, including Barrington Britt, who dominated in the conference championship championship. Nehemiah Dalton's a stud. Matt Burnett is great. So is Luther Lexerus. And then their defense is phenomenal with guys like Bolt Bebley, Ezekiel Uwazurike, Justin Kaplan, Jamison Gray, amongst others. The TCU Horned Frogs came out of nowhere this season, winning the Big 12. They were pretty good last year, but I don't think anybody saw this coming. The Horned Frogs were phenomenal really throughout the entire season, with their only loss coming pretty late in the year. They have some really impressive wins. They beat Missouri early in the season, good win against Houston, crazy comeback against Texas, big win against Alabama, and Alabama was ranked number 2 at the time of that game. Nice win over Baylor. Obviously, they lost against Oklahoma State, but they rebounded in the conference championship with a good win against Missouri. The big storyline with TCU this year is, despite Cade Brown having a good season last year, they decided to start Sterling Yorkshire, and that decision has paid off really well. Yorkshire was fantastic in the conference championship. Harry Stewart is developing to a young budding star. And then if you look at their receivers, Mario Hamler is one of the best tight ends in the country. And again, their defense is phenomenal. Kamani Battle, Cody Harris, Matumbe Afolabe, maybe the best linebacking core in the country. They've got some great defensive linemen as well, with JoJo Adiamoa and Maurice Spence, along with Big Perk Thorncraw. And the secondary is great too, led by the cornerback duo of Roderick Williamson and Nate Amazu. The Oklahoma Sooners had an up-and-down season, but they were able to win the SEC championship and get into the playoffs. This is another team of unfinished business. I thought they were the second-best team in the country last year. If they had beaten Georgia in the conference championship, they would have been the favorite to make the playoff and win the whole thing, in my opinion. But they ended up losing that game, and they fell just short. There were some major hiccups early in the year with 2 early losses to Florida and Georgia. But Oklahoma really rebounded after that with good wins against Auburn and Mississippi State. They did lose to Texas A&M, but, I mean, this is one of the hottest teams in the country. They've scored 40 points in 7 of their last 9 games. They've scored at least 50 in 3 consecutive games. Of course, they've got Romeo Colucci at quarterback, who's really developed nicely this year. He's improved every single week. And then their ground game has just destroyed Kentucky. They ran for nearly 550 yards against Kentucky in the SEC championship. Darion Seals is really, really good. Obviously, you got Colucci. And then at wide receiver, Bryce Berry III is going to be a first-round pick. Justin Bruneau, Matt Montgomery, and Noah Hampton are all really solid as well. The offensive line is good. The defense is solid as well. Very young group. It's got a great front unit with Gilbert Smith, Udo Afolabe, and Rayshawn Russell. And then their secondary is a young, improving unit as well. Their defense isn't great, and I'm a little bit concerned about that going into the playoff, but I really, really like their team. The last team with an automatic bid to the college football playoff is the Cal Golden Bears, who won the Pac-12 championship over Washington. Now, this team isn't a juggernaut by any means. They went 8-4 in the regular season. They really struggled early with some losses to Washington State, Oregon State, UCLA, and Colorado within the first 10 weeks of the season. But they have really locked in ever since that loss to Colorado. They obviously had the big win against Stanford to win the division and put themselves in the conference championship. And then, of course, an unbelievable comeback against Washington, in which they outscored Washington 29-0 in the fourth quarter. Rufus Motley passed Brennan Leach to be the starter this season at quarterback, and Motley has had his ups and downs. We saw that for sure in the Pac-12 championship, but he is dynamic as a runner. Marquette Collins is great too, and they've got some young, talented receivers led by Julian Abutius, who already has over 1,000 yards on the season. Cal's got a pretty good offensive line. Right tackle Omar Irons is going to be a first-round pick, and then their defense is really talented as well. Hyman Crawley, Zishan Juthani, and Kobe Bryant lead the way. Bryant, of course, was the hero in the Pac-12 championship with the big pick 6. He also had 9.5 sacks this season to go with 25 tackles for loss. And then cornerback Troy Danham was one of the best players at his position in the country. So those are the 6 teams who are already in the college football playoff. What your job will be is to seed them in order from 1 to 6. Now we got to figure out the other 6 teams, the at-large bids. I have determined 15 teams who I think are worthy of consideration. We'll go through their resume and why they should or should not enter the college football playoff. So let's start with the Florida Gators of the SEC. They went 10-2 this year, 7-2 in conference. They had a great season. The Gators started the year off red hot. They lost back-to-back games against Kentucky and Alabama, but they have not lost since week 6. Neither of those losses were bad. They were close games against good teams, and then they have multiple top 25 wins. They beat Oklahoma, who's in the playoff. They beat Georgia, who might get in the playoff. And then they had a big comeback in Week 14 against Florida State. Florida's led by a very talented offense, including quarterback Ernie Capellar, who started the season on fire. He cooled off, but is still really good. Elijah Bryant is a stud out of the backfield. He only has 151 carries. I think Florida really wanted to save his usage for the college football playoff. We've got plenty of playmakers out wide as well with Deontay Perkins and Louis Diamantillus, and the defense is really solid as well. They've got a really good front unit with Sadiq Reed Jr., Bird Meyer Vincent, and then in the secondary, Johnny Lee Farr is going to be a high pick. Donovan Bambo at corner, he's really good as well. Next up, we got Michigan from the Big Ten. These guys made the college football playoff last year. They went 10-2 this year. Now, if you look at Michigan's losses, they both were blowouts against Oregon and then Ohio State, both of which were at home. These are the two best teams Michigan faced this year, and, they got absolutely killed in both games. However, they won all the other games that they needed to win. They beat Indiana, who's a good team. They beat USC. They blew out Penn State on the road. That's their statement win, I think, without a doubt. Of course, they're led by the senior quarterback, Bartholomew Blount, who's took a step down from his junior season, but was still pretty solid this year and still looks like he'll be a first-round pick. They've got plenty of playmakers on offense. Casey Aceron and Emmett Denzil are a really good 1-2 punch out of the backfield. And then a wide receiver, TK Thomas might be a first-round pick. Evan Baker, Creed Raven, and Isaiah McGowan are all pretty solid as well. Their defense is pretty talented too, although they did take a step down statistically this year, but they do have some good players. Michael Winters, Kale Hamp, Alex Savage III, Maxo Bazili, and then of course at corner, Costello Benedetto, one of the best defensive backs in the country. One of the big storylines this year was Notre Dame joining the Big Ten. The Fighting Irish won 10 games last year and nearly got into the playoff. This year they were really solid as well, going 9-3. Through the first couple of weeks, they looked like one of the best teams in the country, but they came back down to earth with losses against Minnesota, Navy, and Nebraska. They do have some good wins here. They beat Oregon on the road in overtime. They didn't lose by more than 7 points, and they are playing some good football these last few weeks. Baz Boyd did not have a great season, but I think he improved throughout the year. Notre Dame's obviously a run-first team. MJ Hill looks like a legitimate Heisman Trophy contender. He ran for 22 touchdowns, the second most scrimmage touchdowns of anybody in the country. Baz Boyd and Jared Richardson both have double-digit rushing touchdowns. They really don't pass the ball a whole lot. This is an option, run-first, old-school offense. They've got a really good O-line, and their defense is great, too. Adiah Ward's going to be a high pick. Raymar Beckett, Arthur Balthazar, Marceau Rome, a bunch of really good players. Joining Notre Dame in the Big Ten this year was the Oregon Ducks, who had a great season. They went 10-2 in the regular season, with their only losses coming by 2 points against USC and then 3 points against Notre Dame prior to the Big Ten championship. The Ducks have some statement wins in here. They blew out Michigan. They handled Indiana. They handled Pitt. Really not a lot of close games in here. They beat Nebraska, which is also a big-time win. And although they lost in the Big Ten championship, they were in the game the entire time against Ohio State. Barrett Cherokee is a total playmaker, although a little bit inconsistent. Noel Hilaire is an awesome running back. Justice Everdeed has broken out this year. They've got a bunch of guys who can catch the football. Their offensive line might be the best in the country. All 5 of their starters are at least 89 overall. That's pretty impressive. Their defense, which was really bad this past season, was a lot better this year, led by guys like Spencer Gotham, Wallace Lee Anderson, Rayleigh Gantola, and then, of course, the cornerback duo of Caleb Kaufman and true freshman Nick Sutton, who had an interception in the Big Ten championship. Sticking in the Big Ten, Nebraska was a huge surprise this year, going 10-2. I've described them as an old-school, hard-nosed, defense-first football team, which is true. But if you look at their offense, they've scored at least 35 points in every single game this year. That's really, really impressive. Senior quarterback Jeff McCoy had a phenomenal season. He was very efficient, he was dynamic, and really made plays for this offense. They've got some good playmakers out of the backfield with senior DeAnthony Ford. He only ran for 4 touchdowns, but I think he's really good along with sophomore Travis Mitchell. Melly Boskets is a great receiver. And then at tight end, they've got a really good player as well with Cayman Grant, and Sean Parker's pretty good too. As I said, their defense is really solid as well. Linebacker Aiden Milligan has been one of the best best defensive players in the country this year. It looks like he'll be a high NFL draft pick down the line. They've got other good linebackers such as Mike Jack and a good defensive line led by James Johnston and then Tim Liang, the senior defensive tackle who's going to get drafted into the NFL this year. So this is a really well-rounded team who doesn't really have any major weaknesses. The defending champion Georgia Bulldogs are up next. And they obviously lost a lot of talent, most notably quarterback Clyde Williamson, who is the number one pick in the NFL draft to the Lions, and he is having an awesome rookie season. But the Bulldogs started off strong. They started 7-1 with their only loss being a 3-point game, but they did kind of struggle down the stretch with losses to Florida and Auburn, putting them in a must-win situation against Kentucky, which they did win, putting themselves at 9-3. Aram Ketchikan had an inconsistent first season as a starter, but he is pretty talented. I think he'd be able to handle the big stage of the college football playoff, and we know everybody else on this team can. Senior running back Patalomayo Moluwalu was the college football playoffs MVP last year. He missed most of this season with an injury, but he's fully healthy and good to go. And along with him on the offense, they have Keith Humphrey, Robin Knox, Montrell Hughes, Quincy Pearson, and Monte Grant. Their offensive line is great. They have 6 guys over 89 overall, rivaling Oregon's great offensive line. Their defense lost a lot of pieces, and thus they were worse than last year, but they do have some very good players. Akeem Fenwa, Dieter Jacobs, Tykeem Rogers, and Grant Rambo lead the front unit. And then in the secondary, they've got some great players like Shad Swisher and Nigel Deacon. Florida State is a very fascinating team to me. They have a very high opponent's record, 75-58, which suggests that they have a high strength of schedule. But on the flip side, they also don't have any top 25 wins. The only top 25 teams they played against were Clemson, who they got slaughtered by, and then Florida, a game that they honestly should have won. I guess Syracuse in overtime would probably be their statement win. That game ended up going to triple overtime, and Syracuse is really good, so I guess it is a statement win. Jacob King had a pretty good season at quarterback. He had some really good performances throughout the year. Of course, Brody Kluge is the engine of this offense. He ran for 20 touchdowns this year and will likely be a first-round pick. Garrett Rodriguez, Romani Pierre-Cross, amongst others, lead the receiving corps. And then their defense is pretty solid as well, with Derek Dunbar, Ebenezer Rosen, Shark Saver III, and then Derek Thompson and Irvin Harris leading the secondary. Next up, we had the Houston Cougars, one of the most fascinating teams in the country because they went 10-2 in the Big 12, which is a Power 5 conference, but not as good as some of the others. They beat Duke early in the season, and that game seemed insignificant at the time, but both of those teams have Heisman contenders at quarterback. They only lost 2 games, one to Iowa State, which is a really bad loss, and then one to TCU. Not as bad of a loss because they only lost by 3 against a really good TCU team. They had a nice ranked win against Baylor, and of course they have possibly the Heisman frontrunner in Kane Sanders, who leads college football in completions, yards, and touchdowns. He has 5,000 yards of total offense with like 60 touchdowns or something. He's been, quite frankly, unbelievable this year, and if Houston goes into the playoff, I think they can beat anybody because of Kane Sanders, and of course his dynamic connection with Kramer Gilderford, who caught 25 touchdowns, the 3rd most in a single season in NCAA history. And if Houston gets into the playoffs, he very well could break that record, which is 27. He would need 2 to tie and 3 to pass it. He's not the only good receiver they had, though. Logan Ayers and Carlo Bilotti III are really good. Their defense is not as strong, however. Their defense is certainly a weak link, but they do have some good players, particularly in the secondary with Travis Smith and Cade Griffin. Penn State is an interesting team as well. They're number 16 in the country. Through the first half of the year, they were really impressive. They were steamrolling through teams. They beat Nebraska on the road, and then things kind of go south. They lose to Indiana. They lose to Ohio State. And yeah, both of those teams are good. Both of those games were on the road. But then the loss against Michigan really hurts their resume. Had they won that game, they'd be a shoo-in to get one of the at-large bids. Not only did they lose, but they got boat raced at home. They got clobbered in front of their own fans. Lyndon Kirkstead, a first-year starter at quarterback, started the year on fire, cooled off, but still really good. Aaron Robinson's a great running back. Shai Jones-Porter is going to be a first-rounder next year. Chad Johnson's probably going to be a first-rounder this year. Evan Smith is a great offensive tackle, and their defense has plenty of talent as well. Baltimore Jackson had a breakout year. Cameron Cash is going to be a high pick pretty soon, and Yusuf Khaledi is really good as well in the secondary. Rutgers moved to the ACC, and they fared quite well, going 9-3. The Scarlet Knights were ranked in the top 25 the entire season. They beat Indiana, which is a big win. They clobbered Memphis. That was the game that Dr. Antoine scored like 6 times. The problem I have with Rutgers, if you look at their losses against Syracuse, Virginia Tech, and Duke, Rutgers got killed in all of those games. Duke and Syracuse are really good. Virginia Tech, not so much. That was Virginia Tech's only win after like week 6 or something. So that's a little bit worse of a loss. And their point differential is only like plus 14, I think. Rutgers is, of course, led by running back Dr. Antoine. Now, they have other good players on the team. Sean Forward is a fine quarterback, but Dr. Antoine is the engine of this team. 15 rushing touchdowns, 6 receiving touchdowns, finishing as a Heisman finalist. I mean, Dr. Antoine was the offense, and I think he would be really fun to watch in the college football playoff. It's just a matter of if Rutgers really has the resume to warrant a playoff spot. Their defense, I think, is underrated. They have some good players. Tommy Ruggieri, Blitz Dixon, Anthony Whitley Grant, all pretty solid. Missouri only lost 2 games in the regular season, and if you look at their schedule, they beat everybody who they should have beaten, but they don't really have a signature win. They did not lose a regular season game after week 4, however. Their only losses come in against TCU on the road by only 6, and then Ohio State they lost by 20, again on the road. And then, of course, Missouri lost the Big 12 championship to TCU as well. Missouri only lost the Big 12 championship by 14 points, but I don't think the game was as close as the score suggests. I mean, West Virginia's a nice win. They're ranked, and that game was on the road. But I feel like Missouri is just missing that signature win. Now, if we look at their team, of course, led by quarterback Latavius Merrington, a graduate transfer from Eastern Washington, and he had a phenomenal season. 46 passing touchdowns, 10 interceptions, finishing as a Heisman finalist. He was so good, along with their number 1 receiver, Tyler Maxwell, who caught 20 touchdowns. Their defense is not horrible. I mean, they've got some good players on the defensive side of the ball. George Stewart, Jay Tompkins, Salufe Jibaro, and then cornerback Jamison Anderson might be a first-round pick this year. I figured I'd throw Central Michigan some love. They did lose 2 games, and they play in the MAC, which I don't know if that's a great combination for getting an at-large bid. They lost to Middle Tennessee State early in the season, although they didn't play badly in that game. But if they had won that matchup, I would like their chances a lot better of getting in. They lost a game late in the year to Ball State, which certainly hurts their chances, but they did win nicely against Buffalo in the MAC championship after being down 24-7. Jason Perez is a really talented quarterback. He played very well in the MAC championship game. Lucas Hauser was also really good in that matchup. Tyler Harris at tight end's an All-American. John Baskerville is a really talented receiver along with Maurice Patton. And their defense, particularly their front unit, they've got some guys. I mean, this is a really good team. They won 11 games for a reason. Fat Buff, the defensive tackle, had 3 sacks in the MAC championship game. Blake Nelson, 24 TFLs, 8.5 sacks on the year. Let's go to Washington now, who positioned themselves very nicely to make the college football playoff before choking in the Pac-12 championship to Cal. They went 10-2 in the regular season. Their first loss was to Buffalo, and I think this is a pretty bad loss. Yeah, Buffalo was good, but Buffalo only won 1 of their first 5 games, and it was that one. That's when Buffalo was playing really horribly. Obviously, they went on a 7-game win streak before making the MAC championship, but I feel like that's a bad loss for Washington, and then they got blown out by Cal. Now, I will give Washington credit. They won the games they needed to. Week 12 against Arizona, Week 14 against Washington State. They had to win both of those games, and they dominated in each of those matchups. Then we go to the Pac-12 championship. They played really well for 3 quarters. They were up, I think, 24-9 going into the 4th, and they completely fell on their face. They were, 8 minutes away from making the college football playoff, and they completely shot themselves in the foot. But they still have a really impressive resume, winning double-digit games. Keontae Jordan, very talented quarterback. Ben Bones and Jason Thornburg are a nice duo in the backfield. And then Anthony Kendrickson, wide receiver 1. My goodness, he was very good throughout this season, played well in the conference championship. And then their defense is really talented. They played very well for 3 quarters in the Pac-12 championship before laying an egg in the 4th. Tony West, Matt Nixon, Davis Slater, and Chip Bowie lead that unit. Want to give some of the other conference championship losers some love. That includes the Duke Blue Devils, who went 9-4. As we look at their schedule, they did lose to Houston earlier in the season, so I think it's going to be hard for anybody to rationalize Duke being ahead of Houston. And maybe that hurts Justin Tucker's Heisman chances against Houston quarterback Kane Sanders. Duke did beat Baylor and Miami. Both of those are good wins. They lost at Pitt by 3. Pitt's not a bad team. That's not a horrible loss. They killed Rutgers. That's a nice win. But then they lose late to Virginia. And then, of course, they got clobbered by Clemson in the ACC Championship. Duke, of course, is led by junior quarterback Justin Tucker, a Heisman candidate, who had a great season for them. But can you really rationalize putting a 4-loss team in the college football playoff? Although they did go 9-3 in the regular season, I don't think them losing in the conference championship should hurt them that much. They've got plenty of playmakers on offense with Jabari Kruger, Jeremy Sanders, David Odorat, Marcus McDaniels, and Ajax Blackwell. Their defense is pretty talented as well. They've got a great cornerback duo with Khaled Neighbors and Wenglin Wall. And then the last team we're going to talk about is Kentucky. The Wildcats also went 9-4, and as we look at the start of their season, they looked really good. Their first 6 games, all against SEC opponents, and they won all of them. Big wins against teams like Florida and Auburn, but something we didn't really notice then that clearly proved to be a problem, they allowed a lot of points, at least 28 per matchup. Then they lost to Temple, which is obviously a big surprise, but they rebounded by scoring 62 against Mississippi State. It looked like the Temple game really wasn't going to be an issue. Kentucky was 9-1 going into week 13. All they had to do was not lose out and pretty much guarantee a playoff spot, and they lost out. The Georgia game, I get it. Georgia had to win to keep their season alive. I'll give Kentucky a pass. But losing to Tennessee at home, and Tennessee is not good. That's a bad loss. And then against Oklahoma, they allowed 540 rushing yards. Can I repeat that? 540. That's bad. Now, Kentucky's got some great players. Isaiah Gordon, phenomenal quarterback. He's going to be a high draft pick, and deservedly so. Fadiala Cisse was incredible in the SEC championship game. Cassius Morris is really good as well. Kentucky, for most of this year, looked like a college football playoff team. But can you really rationalize putting them in after losing 3 games in a row, after seeing how soft their defensive line was against Oklahoma? And they've got some good players on the defensive line. Marcus McBride, he's going to be a high draft pick in a couple years. Ingram, Weber, and then in the secondary, Jazz Cunningham and Terry McMichaels are really good, along with Landon Ashby and London Litchfield. So there you go. Those are the 15 teams up for the 6 at-large bids. Again, the link is in the description to go vote. Let's talk about some of the awards, specifically the Heisman Trophy. I've narrowed it down to 8 finalists for the award. We'll start with Justin Tucker from Duke. The game gave him the Heisman, but again, we're doing our own vote here. Justin Tucker has started since his true freshman season and has drastically improved all 3 years at Duke. This year, he was phenomenal. 66% completion percentage, 44 passing touchdowns, 10 rushing touchdowns, over 5,000 yards of total offense, elevating Duke to a 9-4 record and winning their division in the ACC. It would have been nice to see him play a little bit better head-to-head against Clemson quarterback Cade Hutchinson, a 4-year starter for the Tigers. Hutchinson this year finished with 72% completion percentage and a 197 quarterback rating, both of which finished at the top amongst every qualified quarterback in the country. He threw for 3,600 yards and 41 touchdowns to just 5 interceptions, and was also a weapon on the ground with 860 yards and 11 touchdowns. In his career, he has scored a grand total of 192 touchdowns. I've got to assume that's the most ever, right? Kane Sanders, statistically, out of Houston, was the best passer in the country. A 3-year starter for the Cougars. This year, he completed 68% of his passes, a passer rating over 180, 4,400 passing yards, which is first in the country, 51 passing touchdowns, also first, and only 6 interceptions. He wasn't as good on the ground as the other quarterbacks we talked about, but still, 600 yards and 6 touchdowns is really solid. Now, you can make the case that having really good receivers like Kramer Gildeford helped him, but on the flip side, you can also make the case that Kane Sanders made Gildeford really good. Let's talk about some of the more under-the-radar candidates, including Sterling Yorkshire from TCU. Statistically, he was not as good of a passer as the first 3 guys we talked about, but I really like his story. Them choosing him over Cade Brown kind of out of nowhere, and obviously it paying off in a major way. He still had a great season throwing the football. 62% completion percentage, 3,400 yards, 33 touchdowns, only 9 interceptions, and then nearly 1,000 yards on the ground with 12 touchdowns, and of course leading TCU to the college football playoff. DeAndre Smith out of Mississippi State had a great season. 65% completion percentage, 3,600 passing yards, and the best touchdown to interception ratio in the country of 44-4. Didn't really provide a ton on the ground, and his team didn't get consideration for the college football playoff, but I still think he definitely deserves to be mentioned. Latavius Merrington out of Missouri completely came out of nowhere. After starting 3 years for FCS Eastern Washington, he transfers to Missouri and dominates. 3,800 passing yards, 46 touchdowns, 10 interceptions, 65% completion percentage, and then on the ground, nearly 800 yards and 10 touchdowns as well. We've also got 2 running backs on the list. The first one is MJ Hill out of Notre Dame. He was pretty much the quarterback of their offense because they are a run-first team. Hill had 301 carries, 1,800 yards, and an NCAA leading 22 touchdowns while being efficient with 6 yards per carry. In the receiving game, he didn't do a whole lot, only 1 catch. Notre Dame's a run-first team, so you can't entirely fault him, but his receiving is certainly not a plus. And then Dr. Antoine we're going to mention as well, just because of how valuable he is to Rutgers. Didn't get the ball as much as MJ Hill from Notre Dame, but he was even more efficient. 222 carries, nearly 1,700 yards, 7.5 yards a carry. That is remarkable. And 15 receiving touchdowns. More explosive plays for MJ Hill as well. And then in the pass game, 16 catches, 311 yards, and 6 receiving touchdowns. That's 22 total touchdowns from scrimmage, which is tied with MJ Hill for the second most in the country, only behind Houston wide receiver Kramer Gildeford, who had 25. So that'll wrap up the episode. If you have not already, make sure to go down in the description and get your voice heard. Make sure to vote for the top 6 teams in the college football playoff, where they will be seeded. Make sure to vote for the final 6 teams in the playoff to get in. Make sure to vote for the Heisman Trophy, along with all of the other big-time awards as well. That'll wrap up the episode. Hope everybody enjoyed. I think the next episode of this series will be out this Saturday, in which I will be having a full reveal for the college football playoff along with all of the awards. So I think the vote will close officially this Friday, tomorrow at 11:59 p.m. So get your votes in by then. And yeah, that'll wrap it up. Peace out.